And I'll introduce Anthony Ware, who is also my colleague. He's Associate Professor of International and Community Development at Deakin University. And in the interests of time, I'll leave your introduction there, Anthony. Please do go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you to everybody at the conference. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from Bunurong land, which is in outer southeastern Melbourne. My background's a little bit different, and this paper's a little bit different in some ways to a good deal of the rest of the panel. Firstly, myself and my colleague, Mark McGillivray, are both development studies specialists, and coming from a development perspective and looking at development from that perspective. I'm the Secretary of the Development Studies Association of Australia and very engaged in that from that perspective. But also because this is a very preliminary exploration. The other three papers that we've heard tonight are the result of some fairly extensive research, whereas ours is actually presenting in some ways, our musings and our early research of a topic, and hoping really that we might be able to define the problem statement a little bit in discussion, in collaboration, engagement with everybody this evening. And so we're kind of exploring this proposition that the triple nexus between development, humanitarian, and peace is plagued by problems, and that the reason for those problems we would suggest, again, this is very preliminary positioning, but we suggest that a lack of conceptual clarity, a lack of theoretical underpinnings of each aspect of the nexus, and a lack of clarity around the theoretical underpinnings underlies the problems in implementation and moving forward with conceptualizing the synergies and complementarities that have been hoped for in the triple nexus. Now, I'm assuming that most people who are in this panel, in this discussion this evening, are somewhat familiar with the idea of the triple nexus, so I'm not going to go into the background very much. Debates about a development humanitarian continuum emerged in the 1990s, generally referred to as a relief development continuum at that time, kind of articulating discussions about a contiguum, about it being disconnected, but the moving backwards and forwards between stages, the complementarity of development and humanitarian in complex emergency sort of situations. The 2000s, the idea of peace needing to be integrated sort of came in, particularly through some of the major international policy-making forums, and obviously really came to the fore after the World Humanitarian Summit. So the grand bargain called for a joining up of humanitarian and development aid, and referred to this as the Nexus. And then the UN Secretary Designate, Antonio Guterres, added sustaining peace in his remarks, in his swearing in, or he was taking the oath of office in December 2016 in front of the General Assembly. He talked about humanitarian response, sustainable development, and sustaining peace, three sides to the same triangle. And so certainly since 2016, the end of 2016, this idea of a nexus, this idea of a triangle has been very prevalent, and I'm sure we're all quite familiar with the terminology. So the idea in the literature notes that many or most crises, particularly protracted or complex emergencies, we see that conflict, underdevelopment, and humanitarian issues are interdependent and are mutually reinforcing in very negative ways. And that really is, in some ways, almost a definition of complex emergencies. And so the point is that the solutions, therefore, need to be just as interdependent. We're combining peace and development and humanitarian efforts should be able to create mutually reinforcing positive action. That the current funding methods and the current ways of working tend to work in silos, and that joining them up should have far greater impact in the long run. Hugo Slim, for example, in 2019, in the New Humanitarian blog, talked about the indivisibility between the purpose and practice of peace, development, and humanitarian action. And so a push to, at very least, coordinate, if not integrate, humanitarian development and peace efforts, especially in long-running humanitarian crises. Okay, so the proposed benefits are relatively obvious, I think. Let me just flick through just for the sake of time and to keep us moving into what I think are the more interesting things. The current critiques of the triple nexus, and there is a lot out there, and I'm just skimming a few of them. The number one would be questions about whether the nexus and bringing peace and development activities into humanitarian work, whether that so challenges the neutrality of humanitarian work that it voids or threatens humanitarian access and the humanitarian space. But there's a range of others there. I'm not going to read everything. Certainly, most of talking about the nexus has come from, has posed it as, for example, Hugo Slim again in that same article said that described it as being humanitarian aid delivered, applied developmentally in order to build up peace. The idea of Marc Dubois suggesting that conceiving short-term action with a long-term vision and needs, paying attention to long-term development consequences of humanitarian approaches and the impact on peace. The idea that perhaps this is a new way of approaching humanitarian work only, or is this actually about all three fields, if you like, coming together? The idea that if it's no longer first and foremost about need, that perhaps if it needs to be part of a bigger, joined up, better planned, longer term effort, that could actually delay immediate response to crises, etc. I'm going to skip through those. I trust that most people have quickly read those because I want to get through to our hypothesis and have plenty of time to talk about this. So we want to suggest that the biggest problem in implementing things around the triple nexus is the lack of conceptual clarity. So the boundaries between humanitarian peace building are always going to be blurry and soft. Definitions have been debated for a long time, and there's theory and practical debates in each of the fields. But if we're going to look for complementarity, then we need to be clearer, we would suggest, we would argue, conceptually, to be able to look for synergies between the three. And I'll get to why in a second. The lack of conceptual clarity comes to the fore in a number of ways. So, for example, where am I in my notes? Sorry, flicking too quickly here. So there's a lot that's been said about the differences between humanitarian and development aid. But, and again, this is just by way of illustration that the OECD Development Assistance Committee define ODA, so official development assistance, which is the measure of the amount of money given by OECD donor countries to development activities or to aid and development, or however you want to phrase it. They talk in terms of official development aid. In that sense, humanitarian is, and always has been since the very beginning of counting ODA, is considered to be a subset of development aid, and it's a subset of the reporting. There's one sense in which, and I'm speaking again, my colleague and I are speaking as development scholars, that a good deal of the distinction, of the drawing of distinctions between development and humanitarian defaults to mischaracterizing development as either being largely about loans, which it isn't, as being largely about promoting economic growth, or focuses on aspects like state building. Now, I'm not saying all does by any means, but the point simply being that definitions of development and humanitarian and peace in this sense really matter and aren't always clear. And certainly some of the latest best definitions of development could be equally applied to humanitarianism. This is simply to point out that there is a great difficulty really in defining the differences and the separability between development and humanitarian, and that the same actually applies to peace as well. If we look at the, again, so our issue is this idea of a lack of conceptual clarity. So conceptualizations of humanitarianism, there's the traditional principles that I trust we're all familiar with. I'm not going to go into those, but obviously some deep debates that have emerged more recently around new humanitarianism or new humanitarian principles, and how much politics should or could, how much advocacy, when to pull out because of a political obstructionism, when to speak out even if it risks access, these debates that are raging within the humanitarian circles. The idea that humanitarian space is essential. So these are some of the things that we've just noted down in terms of key conceptualizations of humanitarianism, and a focus on the individual, on protection of life and dignity, saving lives and dignities at the individual and community level first and foremost. Contrasting that a little bit with development, you know, the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s ideas of stages of economic growth have well and truly moved on from that way of thinking to thinking far more about contextual ways of enhancing well-being. But there's so many models, and there are so many debates about models and approaches to development and theory, not even a sense of overarching theories of development anymore. And so when we use the term development, what of this do we actually even mean? Certainly there is a sense in which development, as opposed to humanitarian, seeks to change structures and systems, and while it does work with communities, also or largely tends to work either with or through or on government systems. The key difference, I guess, between humanitarian and development would have to be that development is inherently political and widely recognised as such. But peace is actually the biggest issue we suggest of the three, in the sense that peace and peace action was introduced by the Secretary General, but what do we actually mean by peace? And people have interpreted this in so many different ways. By peace, do we mean peace building, or do we mean security, or do we mean stabilization, or do we mean social cohesion? Is the peace is the development security nexus or the humanitarian security nexus part of this? Is this what we're talking about, or are we talking about something else? You know, and peace building has become almost something of a catch-all phrase. Let me quickly illustrate. This is my second last slide, so we're almost there. With the Nippon Foundation's funding of development activities in eastern Myanmar, in Mon State, and that's my primary field of research, and we've just published a paper on this. But the Nippon Foundation's work in an area under ceasefire that has not yet negotiated a sense of peace accord. And our argument, and I think it's fairly widely established, is that fairly well established, is that they were really pursuing, or they have been pursuing, a peace dividend in a period of ceasefire well before a sense of political agreement. And the question has to be as to whether that kind of development activity, or in an attempt to establish peace, actually undermines the possibilities of a longer-term peace agreement. I could go into details, but I won't. Simply to point out that the question of what sort of peace and when and how peace interrelates with development, let alone with humanitarian, is actually exceedingly complex. And because our conceptualization of what these are is so clouded, we would argue that that this is actually what undermines much of the thinking about the nexus. So our propositions, and this is my final slide, so I'm just concluding here. Our propositions are these. Firstly, that the triple nexus is plagued by implementation problems, largely due to a lack of conceptual clarity. The second one is that, sure, the definitions and boundaries are always going to be blurry, and it's always going to be lots of debates, but they are so blurry at this point so the corollary of the previous point, that poor understanding of and definitions of the theoretical underpinnings of each aspect of the nexus, each side of the triangle, undermine our attempts at really planning implementation. This undermines the conceptual and thus practical applications of the triple nexus by encouraging conflation of ideas and convergence in practice. And if I had more time to discuss this, this is what I'd focus on. And that is that what tends to happen, we would argue, is because of a lack of clarity, that peace and development are seen to be done together rather than seem to be done in coherence and complementing and looking for synergies. That the one action is thought to deliver peace outcomes because it's good development, or vice versa, and the same applying, of course, to humanitarian. And so our argument is that the triple nexus relies on identifying the synergies and interrelationships and complementarities of distinct modes of practice, and that must be based on distinct conceptualizations of the issues. That may need to be very, very locally contextual, and maybe that's part of the problem, is that we've been looking too macro and not looking contextually enough. But the triple nexus is plagued by problem because we don't have the conceptualizations clear enough to be able to work out the synergies, interrelationships, coherence, and to keep distinct modes of practice separate but complementary and synergistically. Thank you very much.